Notices of motion. Member for Member Cook Tantamar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And before tabling this motion, I'd like to give a bit of a trigger warning that this following motion includes some graphic statistics that could be disturbing for some people. I give notice that on April 1st, 2021, I shall move the following resolution, seconded by the member for Fredericton South. Whereas, in 2018, 579 sexual assaults were reported to the police in New Brunswick. Whereas, according to Statistics Canada, New Brunswick has seen a 27% increase in sexual assaults reported to the police since 2012. Whereas the number of people charged with sexual assault in New Brunswick has dropped from 53.2% to 36.3% since 2012. Whereas 87% of sexual assault victims in New Brunswick were women, and almost half of these were victims under the age of 18. Whereas a Globe and Mail article published in February 2017 entitled "Will the Police Believe You?" found that Canada's national average of unfounded complaints for reported sexual assault was 32% in New Brunswick, the highest in Canada. Whereas in Canada, Indigenous women are 3 times more likely to experience sexual assault. Whereas people who identify as lesbian, gay, and bisexual are twice as likely to report experiencing violent victimization compared to those who identify as heterosexual. Whereas 61% of trans youth surveyed in Atlantic Canada aged 14 to 18 reported they had experienced sexual harassment within the past year. Whereas sexual violence can have long-lasting impacts on survivors, being linked to mental health difficulties, including depression and PTSD, feelings of shame, self-blame, fear, and distressing memories of the experience. Whereas New Brunswick Women's Council advises that the government increase funding for preventing and responding to sexual violence and improve police response to sexual violence. Whereas in 2019, 71% of students in Canadian post-secondary institutions witnessed or experienced unwanted sexualized behaviours in a post-secondary setting. Be it therefore resolved that the Legislative Assembly urge the government to fully implement and fund the recommendations and actions in Preventing and Responding to Sexual Violence in New Brunswick, a Framework for Action. Be it further resolved that the Legislative Assembly urge the government to examine the gaps in victim services provisions through the Department of Justice and Public Safety to identify and address gaps, especially in relation to where the crime occurred. Be it further resolved that the Legislative Assembly urge the government to increase funding for frontline services, including transition houses, and increase funding for trauma-informed support services, including access for all public post-secondary campuses. Be it further resolved that the Legislative Assembly urge the government to adopt legislation requiring standalone campus violence policies for all publicly funded universities, and including provisions ensuring student involvement in the drafting and amending process, as well as built-in metrics to guarantee the clarity of the reporting structure at each institution. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.